The third part of this history concerns creatures that would look quite familiar to most of us. And it includes several species with names like Heidelbergensis and Neanderthalensis and Sapiens. Let me tell you a little bit about these creatures. Here we have groups with variations in head size, or cranium size I should say, which are a little bit confusing to people addled by the ape-man or caveman image. Neanderthalensis brain was in volume larger than ours. The brain case was differently shaped and a little more rearward extension rather than upward bread loaf, but bigger is bigger. And we also are talking about Heidelbergensis, a fascinating creature whose skulls are scattered all over the place, in Europe in particular, and looks maybe not too different at all. Perhaps a bit of a smaller brain case. And here we have this interesting story of dispersal as well as diversification. Again, let's take a look at Neanderthalensis, which is primarily a Mediterranean species and with some in other parts of Europe. And then we can take a look at Heidelbergensis, which is also a Mediterranean species and in parts of the Levant and Europe. And then we take a look at the earliest sapiens, which are in Africa. Now, what did these creatures do? The two of four named species didn't really seem to go too far. We don't find their fossils anywhere else, and they also seem fairly constrained in time. Sapiens wandered afar. And before we start making all these out-of-Africa excitement statements, let's bear in mind the size of Africa and that dispersal across Africa in and of itself is a nigh astonishing set of diversification and dispersal right there. So this one species, without speciating, ends up going all across Africa and then, of course, two parts north and east. After that, then we start seeing remarkable dispersal of Homo sapiens and effectively throughout the entire old world. But before we start talking about hopping over the Bering Straits, before we start talking about the global distribution of modern Homo sapiens, let's go back a little bit and see what happened to our fascinating little group of similar species. We're talking about the Pleistocene. We're talking about an ice age. When we are talking about one of the great mass extinctions in the history of the planet. This one hit the large land animals and mammals particularly hard. This is why we only have a couple species of many groups of mammals. And in many cases, we'll see a couple of big species that are impressive, and then we find fossils of a wide number of other species, some of which were much bigger and remarkably diverse in all kinds of scary ways. Now this looks a little familiar. You can see the same thing in our history. We have a group, Homo, with several species, most of which that we know about are limited in range, and one which, for whatever reason, has a propensity to breed quite a lot and wander quite far, and when the mass extinction comes along and vorps them, which one do you think there's a few left of? Thus, we have the situation of, yet again, a continuing diverse history of the genus Homo, and then it gets hammered, sideswiped in the mass extinction events, and instead of the entire group going extinct, we end up with one species. The word to know here is relict, not relic, relict with a T, and that simply means a creature most of whose close relatives are extinct. This also adds the interesting possibility that either Neanderthalensis or Heidelbergensis, or both, ended up being caught up in the various dispersal of Homo sapiens and, being what we are, breeding back into the population, such that we end up with various genetic and physiological features of Heidelbergensis and Neanderthalensis scattered through our diversity. Is that possible? Absolutely. Is there evidence for it? It's looking likely, in fact. So we have this great history of ours. We have a fascinating instance of diversification. We have a great instance of this mass extinction. We've got a couple of interesting questions about the fates of widely distributed versus narrowly distributed members of the group, and all kinds of skulls and bones to look at from all of them.